Hello, everybody. Today we are in Unit 3, Day 5, and today we're going to be talking about the Revolutionary War. So let's jump right into that. You can see here on the opening slide, I put the join or die drawing, which was created by Ben Franklin. This was actually created earlier than the Revolutionary War, but the whole purpose of this political cartoon that he drew was to encourage the colonies to work together, and that if they did not work together, then it meant certain death for all of the colonies. Just like if you cut a portion out of a snake, it's going to die. And if you look there, the V in the little loop of the snake, that represents Virginia. All right, there's a commercial here that I want you to watch for George Washington. I hope that you enjoy it. It's pretty funny to watch that commercial. So at the beginning of the Revolutionary War, you got to understand the Patriots were underdogs. Great Britain had pretty much all the advantages going into this war. And that's why it would be shocking if the Patriots were to win the Revolutionary War, because they were at every disadvantage. Great Britain had more population, they had greater wealth, they had a greater army, not only their British army, but they also had German Hessian mercenary soldiers as well. They had the experienced soldiers. They also had loyalists here in the colonies as well. They had the support of Indian tribes. And as for the Americans, if you look at their advantages, really, the biggest advantage that the Patriots had is that they knew the land and the territory and that they were fighting for their home, whereas you're going to see otherwise very economically and militarily weak, had no real central government. You did have the Continental Congress, but again, there was no central government really connecting all of the colonies together, and had very poorly trained troops. And again, here you can see a cartoon of George Washington there asking for some tanks. So Patriots, you're going to see the largest number of Patriots that you have are from Virginia and New England. I encourage you to check out the scene from The Patriot when they talk about getting South Carolina on board with the American Revolution, and especially pay attention to what the one representative says about South Carolina is not, and then how he finishes that statement. You're going to see that soldiers were usually very reluctant to travel out of their own region. And again, this is something that had been going on in the colonies and would continue even into the new nation, where a lot of colonists saw themselves more so as a Virginian than as an American. So a lot of times soldiers, they would fight for a short time and then they would leave to go back and work on their farms and then return to duty. And you'll see the Continental Army, again, was very short on supplies, very poorly equipped. Payments were hard to get. It was hard to get Congress on board with supporting them in big ways. And that's something that George Washington wrote about continually throughout the war, about how the army needed more support. Now, you would have African Americans that would fight in the Continental Army. As I said yesterday, the British promised freedom to any enslaved person who would join their side. So in response to that, Congress would also make the same offer. And you'd have roughly 5,000 African Americans who would fight as patriots, most of them being free citizens from the North. So as you'll see, most of them weren't actually slaves. They were freed African Americans that fought. Pictured here on the slide is Peter Salem, who is one of the most famous of African Americans to fight in the Continental Army. He fought for 5 years and was recognized for his bravery during the war. Now, Loyalists and Tories, like I said, you had a lot of Loyalists here. Up to 60,000 of them actually fought next to British soldiers. Surprisingly, you'll see Ben Franklin, his son, William Franklin, who had been part of the royal government of New Jersey. He sided with the Tories, and eventually him and his father's relationship really never recovered from that, because after the war, William moved to Great Britain, and even though they did see each other again, the relationship never really recovered. And you're going to see most of your Loyalists are like in Georgia, New York, New Jersey. If you're familiar with the book Washington Spies, a lot of that focuses on New York and the Culper Ring there, and the spying activity that happened, because, like I said, New York was full of Loyalists, especially in New York City. Again, natives, a lot of times they sided with the British because the British didn't want to allow the colonies to expand out in the West. And really, you're going to see that most Americans remain neutral in this. If you've ever seen The Patriot, and in that scene that we watched there, he talks about how the war is going to affect everybody. And that's how a lot of people felt about the war. They didn't want to get involved because they were worried about what it could do to them, and they were kind of afraid of taking either side in the war. So Battle of Long Island, really what you're going to see with New York is that New York City would pretty much remain in the hands of the Loyalists the entire time. This Battle of Long Island, it would be a British victory. You'd have 32,000 British troops who would land outside of New York City. Howe would defeat the Americans. And basically what would happen is the Americans would be pushed up against, you can kind of see it on this map here, would be pushed right up against New York Bay, basically with no way to escape. And at night, under the cover of darkness, you're going to see the Continental Army would retreat under this darkness after being almost fully surrounded by General Howe. And again, this is another example of George Washington's very good leadership in helping them to get off of Long Island and be able to retreat. And really, it shocked the British to wake up the next morning and realize that the Continental Army was completely missing, that they had all evacuated and made it across the New York Bay there. And the beginning years of the war, not very good for the Continentals at all. They would lose New York City and Philadelphia during this time, and the British had to be feeling pretty good about the war in the early parts of it. Fast forward to Christmas 1776, the Battle of Trenton, which would be an American victory. British had halted their campaign for winter, which was military custom. That would be military custom through even the Civil War to do that. But on Christmas night, 1776, Washington would lead troops across the frozen Delaware River to surprise the British at Trenton. And this would be really, really important because not only did you have British troops there, but most of the troops that were there were actually German Hessian paid mercenary soldiers that were there, and 1,000 of them ended up surrendering. Now, again, this is more of a morale boost than anything to get this victory in 1776 in the way that they did. You can see the famous painting there of the bottom of Washington leading his troops across the Delaware River there to surprise them. And actually, they think that a lot of the German troops that were there probably were slightly intoxicated and had been up that night partying because it was around Christmas time. So the military strategy, General Howe of the British Army, he said, win the surrender, but don't destroy them. Now, the reason he wanted that is because he sees it as, hey, these are our brethren. These are fellow British subjects. So we don't want to destroy them because they are, in a sense, our brothers and sisters, and we don't want to destroy them. The problem with this, and this is a problem that we've even seen today in our current military situation, is that if you don't, in a sense, destroy the other side, then that feeling of rebellion is going to continue on, and you're going to be fighting in a perpetual war. For the United States, we've seen that in like Vietnam, in the Middle East, in those places. So that is the problem with that. Washington, his goal was to avoid a major defeat. He said, on our side, the war should be defensive. So basically, they wanted to draw the British away from the coast, which would extend their supply lines and make it difficult for them. And another reason to draw them away from the coast is because, remember, the British had the best navy in the world at that time, and the United States pretty much didn't have a navy during that time. We had a very small one. So we knew we couldn't beat them on the sea, but if we got them and pulled them into land and they fought in the way that we wanted them to fight, things could help, and hopefully we could sap their morale and get them to the point where they just didn't want to fight anymore. So again, Continental Army, very undermanned and undertrained. So in October 1777, we would have another big American victory at the Battle of Saratoga. The British would continue to try to cut off New England from the rest of the colonies. Howe wanted to attack Philadelphia and end the rebellion with one simple victory. That would not be the case. And remember, what was in Philadelphia was the Continental Congress during that time. Even though they did were able to surround Philadelphia in a way, they weren't ever able to really fully take Philadelphia. And you're going to see that the British and Howe would be very slow in executing their plan, and that is what would lead to their defeat at the Battle of Saratoga. You may have heard of the traitor Benedict Arnold. Benedict Arnold actually is a major reason why the Continentals won this army. This is before he had betrayed the U.S. Army during this time, but he is a major reason beside that. In fact, if you go to the Saratoga battlefield today, they actually have a monument to him there showing his boot, because he did get shot in the leg and injured pretty badly during the battle, but they don't have his name on there at all because they wanted to honor him, but people were so disgusted with him being a traitor afterward, they didn't even want to put his name on that. Now, the reason that Saratoga is so important is because this marked a turning point of the war, because Ben Franklin to this point had been over in France, trying to get the support of the French leadership. And this battle here showed that the Continental Army could win. And this is what ensured the military alliance that we had with France. France didn't want to come in feeling like they had to do all the heavy lifting that we couldn't win. And this is that battle that showed them that we could actually win a battle. So wartime difficulties. Again, British Navy, a lot better than us. So they did do a naval blockade during this time that cut off pretty much all of the colonies from European goods. Also, you got to remember Boston, New York during this time are occupied, which led to rising unemployment. You're going to start to see that government officials, continental government officials, start requisitioning goods directly from the people. Basically, they would go to you and say, hey, I see you have these horses. We need them for the continental cause. We're going to write a requisition and take those, and you will be paid for those. Civilians, a lot of time, especially in these areas that were under British control, Boston, New York, were exposed to displacement from their homes and a lot of times death. And you're going to see that soldiers from both armies would loot, sometimes rape, and burn farms. States would print money to try to help with this, but a lot of times that state money was worthless. You will see that Congress does borrow gold from France, printed their own money, but it was not worth very much money at all. And a lot of times farmers realized they could get more money out of selling to the British. So a lot of them would do that, would sell directly to the British because they could make more money as a result of that. So just know that things in the colonies were not that great for colonists here because we were fighting a war and because of the blockades that the British put in place. Valley Forge, probably the most infamous of showing just how bad things were for the Continental Army. You'll see during the winter of 1777 to 79, the Continental Army was in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. Conditions were absolutely horrific there. You'd have soldiers get frostbite, disease, and that kind of thing, and get very, very sick. And that hurt military morale during this time. Now, eventually, you would have Baron von Steuben who would come in. He came in having a lot of military experience from overseas, and he put in a system of drill and maneuver, which helped the army to become tougher and better disciplined. He worked very, very closely with George Washington in doing this. And actually, Baron von Steuben is credited a lot with what he did to help get the Continental Army prepared for future battles. Now, as I mentioned, Ben Franklin was over in France trying to get the help of France with this. The French do decide to get involved with this, hopefully to avenge their loss of Canada to the British. So, Treaty of Alliance 1778, what that said is that the French were going to help us out. We agreed, though, not to sign any peace treaty until our independence was ensured and then until France had also declared peace with that as well. So that's why you're going to see Yorktown happens in 1781, but the colonies don't sign the Treaty of Paris until 1783 because we had to wait for France to be at peace with Great Britain before we could sign a peace treaty with them during that time. We also made some other concessions to the French there that we would recognize their conquest in the West Indies and that kind of stuff. But again, this would be vital for us because the French had a navy, which we did not have a strong navy. And also that ensured them getting us money and other things, access to supplies that we needed during this time. Also, you're going to see in 1778 that Parliament does repeal the tea and prohibitory acts and renounce the power to tax the colonies. So basically now they're going back on everything that they had said before the war. Unfortunately, that was too little, too late. And you're going to see that Congress would reject these, partly because we had that alliance with France now, so we weren't as worried as being dependent on Great Britain. In the South, you're going to see that there was also fighting in the South during this time. Most of that was led by Cornwallis and others in the South. France, again, you're going to see that these other countries that do get involved in it, Spain wouldn't get involved directly here, but they would be involved in other aspects of that. But they had their own ulterior motives for joining as well, hoping that they could gain something out of fighting against the British and beating them. And remember, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and that's kind of the thought that they had through this. You will see that after losing parts of the Ohio Territory, the British do shift to the Southern strategy. Their hope was to be able to gather a lot of the crops there, such as tobacco and rice and that kind of thing. They also wanted to take advantage of some of the racial divisions that you saw in the South because of the large amount of African American slaves that you had there as well. And the British were able to be very, very successful in the South, in Georgia, in South Carolina, on those areas. They were able to quickly take over. And remember, in Georgia had a lot of loyalists there, so that helped as well. You will see that the Dutch get involved in this and declare war against Britain, and French troops would also be sent here as well. So it's kind of like the whole world is coming together to fight the British in this. So with this, as I mentioned, fighting in the South, you're going to see that the Continental General, Nathaniel Greene, he devises a new strategy to divide the militia into small groups with strong leaders to harass the less mobile British. Because remember, the British are still fighting the old style of warfare, whereas the Continentals have learned a lot about fighting in the woods and guerrilla warfare and that kind of stuff. So you're going to see that they changed their strategy a little bit. And most famously, this would happen in South Carolina. If you've seen the movie The Patriot, it's loosely based on the stories of Francis Marion and others in South Carolina. But up and down the South, you're going to see guys like Francis Marion, Light Horse Harry Lee, who would be the father of Robert E. Lee. You're going to see that these guys would lead groups to harass the less mobile British army. And I'm sorry, they're playing music over the PA, so you're going to hear that in the background. All right, so with that strategy, that basically just drove the British crazy. What they would do with that is just, again, try to divide and distract them as much as possible. One thing that the Continental Army also did was focus on taking out your leadership of the armies, such as your captains and that kind of thing. That disgusted the British because the British said, you can't go off picking off officers because that is bad for the men, and it was considered kind of like something you didn't do in war. Continentals did it anyway. So with that, the harassment, ended up the Continental Army is able to push Cornwallis and his men into Yorktown, Virginia. If you've ever been to Yorktown, you know Yorktown backs up to the York River and then out to the Chesapeake Bay. Now, Cornwallis to this point had been able to depend on the British Navy backing him up. But the French arrived on the scene, and as you can see in the painting there, the French were able to block the Chesapeake Bay and prevent the British ships from getting in there. That is going to lead Cornwallis. He really has no choice at this point but to surrender because his army was very, very weakened. They didn't have the British Navy, and they were surrounded by the French and the Americans. You're going to see at this point, the army war is starting to become very unpopular in Great Britain. Parliament blames military leadership for this, but again, you're going to see that a lot of British people were tired of the war and said, hey, let's just let them have their independence. So what were the reasons for victory here? Factor one is the military. George Washington was an outstanding leader who recruited outstanding officers to shape the army. And really, George Washington's leadership is what helped keep the military together during this very, very trying time. Also, George Washington avoided situations that would threaten his army. George Washington realized that the only hope that the Continental Army had was to fight a defensive war. So he tried to avoid those situations that would threaten his army, just like he did at the Battle of Long Island. When he realized the battle was over, he evacuated his army and got out of there. And that actually happened several times during the war, that George Washington was able to do that, evacuate his army out to be so they could fight this defensive war. Also, you have the use of guerrilla warfare. Again, I mentioned that with Francis Marion and Francis Lighthorse Harry Lee there, the father of Robert E. Lee, who was involved in this guerrilla warfare. Factor two, geography. Again, the Continental Army was fighting on their territory with their own militia who could be very quickly mobilized. And that's one thing that the British did not have. Again, I go back to the movie The Patriot because there's a line in there where a guy says, who knows every, trail and that kind of stuff in the area. And of course, it's the people that actually lived here in the colonies. The British did not have that advantage, so that put them at a real disadvantage, especially when you start fighting a guerrilla style type warfare. It makes it difficult to be able to engage with the enemy and be able to defeat them. Also, geography, you have the Atlantic Ocean between us and Great Britain. That would be a huge issue. You're looking at best 4 weeks for the British for them to get supplies and that kind of thing here. But usually it was in the 4 to 6 week period. During that time, very difficult to fight a war over an ocean like they were doing. 3, diplomatic, the support from France, again, that would be huge in our war effort. As you saw there in the Battle of Yorktown, the French Navy being there is what helped us to win there and is what led to the surrender of Cornwallis there. And then factor 4, political, you're going to see a lot of Americans preferred Patriot rule. Even though a lot of Americans did remain neutral during this, they preferred Patriot rule over the Loyalist forces or having an occupation by the British. And as I mentioned, the war grew very unpopular in Great Britain. Remember in 1781 when Cornwallis had surrendered, at that point you had the war essentially going on for 6 years. At the end of it, 8 years. A lot of the British are tired with it. If you go back and look at the notes of Parliament, you'll see there was a lot of discussion within Parliament about ending the war early and pulling out of the colonies completely. So, triumph. Treaty of Paris happens in 1783. Great Britain would recognize the independence of the colonies and give up any other claims on lands south of the Great Lakes. The land between the Mississippi River and the Appalachian Mountains would be the domain of pro-British Indian people. And again, slowly you're going to see the colonies start to encroach on that territory. Americans would receive North Atlantic fishing rights. So, hey, Americans love to fish, and so we got some fishing rights there. It also forbade the British from carrying away any property, including slaves, during this time. And it gave the colonies freedom of navigation of the Mississippi River, which is very, very important as far as trade going down to New Orleans and getting out to the Gulf of Mexico. Now, with this, you're also going to see the American government promise to allow British merchants any debts that there were before the war. They could collect on those debts, and it also encouraged the state governments during this time to give back any property to loyalists that they had taken. And again, you're going to see that as a point of contention that's going to come up later when we're talking about the development of our new nation here. But yeah, they did allow that as well. So the British would make peace with France and Spain as well with the signing of the Treaty of Versailles. Yes, there's been many Treaty of Versailles throughout history, and this is just yet another. So you're going to see really the only country that gains from any of these treaties is the colonies in the United States. And now North America was now open for settlement, and North America was now its own country. So there is something for you to do on assignment where you're going to role play like you are one of these people, and basically you need to justify what side that you think that they would fight on during the war, and write down the reasons why you think that they would fight for that side. Also, there is another assignment for you to do where you're going to look up 4 different flags from the American Revolution, include a picture of that flag, and basically tell what that flag represented and that kind of thing. And you can read the instructions there with this. And you can see this political cartoon here showing the American rattlesnake there and how it is surrounding the groups of soldiers there, the groups of British soldiers as they fight in the Revolutionary War. So again, that brings us very, very quickly through the Revolutionary War and the birth of our country. And now that the war has happened and the colonies have won, now the really, really tough part starts, which is where you start to form a government and decide what the country is going to look like after the war. And you're going to see probably some of your most contentious battles are going to come as we create our new country and decide what that looks like. And I think overall, when you look at the context of the United States, our full history, some of the things that our government is fighting about today, some of the things that you're hearing about in the news, is stuff that we've been fighting about since the very, very beginning. And that just goes to show that creating a country and having a country and sustaining a country, it's not easy work, and it's going to lead to a lot of conflict between different groups because everybody has in their own mind what they think the best type of government is and what they think government best looks like. So with that, next class, again, we will be jumping into the birth of our country after the American Revolution. I hope you have a great day.